We made it taboo to speak the truth. We stigmatized the truth about sex, and we stigmatized any kind of viewpoint diversity. So we can't make policy if we can't actually listen to multiple stakeholders because they don't feel safe speaking up.
Well, hello out there in podcast land. Delighted to be with you here in the new year, the new era of the Trump 2. As you know, at the TLP podcast, we bring you the very finest in heterodox political conversation and analysis with the most interesting and stimulating guests. And today I'm very happy to have Lisa Selin Davis. So Lisa's the author of 2 novels and about 600 essays and articles about film, travel, environment, real estate, parenting, you name it, and all the usual suspects, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, blah, blah, blah. And she's written 2 nonfiction books, Tomboy, The Surprising History and Future of Girls Who Dare to Be Different, and Housewife, Why Women Still Do It All and What to Do Instead. And we're going to touch on that a little bit. And she's currently working on a new book about the youth gender culture war, which we may also touch on eventually. But she's also the proprietor of a fantastic Substack, Broadview, which is how I originally encountered her. And this is a highly recommended Substack for those who are curious about the evolving debate about gender ideology and related policy issues. And I find her a remarkable and persuasive voice of reason. However, not everybody feels that way. And this is relevant to our conversation. I happened to notice that when I Googled her name, you know how Google gives you a capsule summary at the top of your search query, and as part of their capsule summary, they had the following: transgender map, Lisa gender versus transgender people. Lisa Selin Davis is an American author and gender critical activist involved in anti-transgender extremism. Wow. So I said, amazing. So do you know about this, Lisa? What's that all about? Have you encountered this? Give us your take.
I have encountered, first of all, this website, Transgender Map, which I'm hesitant to send people to, but I actually think it's central to why this story is so misunderstood. And it's a website started by a trans activist named Andrea James. And she catalogs every single person who talks about this issue. And if you were ever trans-identified in any way, it's your name and transgender people. If you have said the wrong thing and were never trans-identified, it's your name versus transgender people. And it gets a lot of hits, so it's usually the top thing that comes up when you Google someone's name if they have spoken the truth / the wrong thing, which are the same.
You're on the blacklist, and they tell you right away. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, far out. So basically, it's some mindless algorithm, I assume, that puts it there. But I'm somewhat offended when I Google my name; it doesn't come up. Oh well. So that's, kind of an indicator of how charged this issue is and how many people are out there trying to, confuse the issue and pitch it to the highest level of hysteria possible. We'll go more into these issues. But first, tell us about your books, Tomboy and Housewife, and the threads that connect them to the issue you're mostly thinking about today, which is the transgender critical gender ideology issue. What's the journey there? What is the connection between these different boxes of things you looked into?
Well, first I want to say, because I didn't say before, thank you so much for having me. I'm a huge fan, and it's really nice to be invited here. Because also I'm often disinvited places, so it's nice to get...
And you're in a safe space.
Well, I'm also in a place where I'm sure we can disagree on things without calling each other names. So I should start by saying I was raised by a single mom who was a hippie type with, hairy armpits, and I was raised in the 70s. I barely knew married people, and I certainly did not know many people living according to traditional gender roles, unless that was women do everything and men get stoned, which may be a tradition in some American subcultures.
Yeah. Tradition of a sort.
So that was the normal that I came from. And I never thought to question anything about the policies or politics of my environment, about the left, about Democrats. I believed that we were good and right and the others were bad and wrong. And when I had a child fairly late in life, she emerged as quite masculine. She just, from the very beginning, from the way she stood to the clothes she wanted to wear to the playmates she chose. And that was a really interesting experience to raise a child like that in the early 2010s, because it happened to be at the same moment that the idea of the trans child was really taking hold in our society. So what I found was a lot of people trying to socially transition her, though I didn't know what that was or that term. And I began to be confused by why there was no room for a child who looked like the kind of idealized girl from my own childhood. We all were dressed like that, whether we were tomboyish or not. Eventually, I wrote an op-ed for the New York Times about that, and that was my first experience of this tension that is ultimately between feminists and people who believe in gender, the theory of gender identity, or what we might call gender identity ideology, a series of beliefs about an innate gender identity that may or may not match one's sex. That's how that book happened. Later, I turned it into a book, kind of exploring the history of masculine girls and the science and psychology, and a little bit of the overlap and tension with this emerging kind of trans movement. And I actually really didn't feel like I told the full truth in that book. And I wanted to. I wanted to go back and explore the things that I had been warned not to. But I couldn't find any way to do that without getting a right-wing publisher, which I wasn't willing to do. I'd probably be more willing now, but I don't have to. And so I ended up writing the Housewife book, in part because I was looking for my next book, and Trump talked a lot about housewives during his failed campaign for president, the one in between. And I became very curious about why this image of the housewife carried so much weight and why we fought over it so much. And in general, why we fight over gender so much. Of course, I haven't defined that word, so I'll just leave that hanging for now.
Yeah, okay. Well, that was the second Trump run, which inspired you to write Housewife. Now you're working on a new book, as we alluded to. But, Trump is getting off to, a strong start in these issues with his executive order about that touches on transgender stuff around, sort of are there really just two biological sexes? What should be the legal status of that? And taking a pretty strong stand that, in fact, that is the case. There are two sexes, and that's all she wrote. So maybe describe for our listeners what's exact. I assume you've looked at it pretty closely. What's in the executive order and what you think its implications are at this point.
So the executive order that Trump has just released reestablishes that there are two sexes, and if you look closely, I think it never uses gender as a standalone term, though. He did talk about genders, I think, in his. I didn't listen to the inauguration.
I think he said it in verbally, but I think in the order itself, they avoid it specifically.
In the order, it uses gender only when it's with something else like ideology, which again is a belief system about gender identity, and that gender identity not only exists in every person and is separate from sex, but should matter more than sex. So when we say gender ideology or gender identity ideology, that's what we're talking about. And I think the intent of the order is to reestablish sex as the rule of the land, which it probably always was, even though we didn't need an executive order to say that, because we divided sex by sports and we divided bathrooms. We divided sports by sex. We divided bathrooms by sex. We divided a lot of society by sex. And the feminist movement, the early first and second wave feminism, they wanted to divide less of society by sex, but that was really about women having the vote, women being able to have bank accounts in their own names, women not being able to be legally raped by their husbands, right? It was not about erasing the reality of biological sex. It was about not being oppressed based on your sex. And what this order does is reestablish the division of our society by sex and not based on your personal subjective sense of yourself. And it's not necessarily the best or the only way to go about a kind of sex-based reset, which I don't think is a terrible idea personally, right now, because a lot of these things that have happened, where in terms of reordering our society by so-called gender identity, happened without the participation of most Americans, and happened without the consent of many Americans, and without Americans understanding what it means. So it's not a terrible idea to say, let's go back to the way things were until 10 years ago, maybe 13 years ago, and figure it out. Obviously, this is heavy-handed and not what it's doing, but if you look at it, it's just espousing mostly biological truths about sex as a reproductive class, and that we have a right to divide our parts of society that way. But I did look a little bit on Blue Sky to see what kind of...
All right, I'm going to make a prediction here. People are not happy.
It's hate. It can only be because of hate, right? It can't be because the movement has gone too far. It can't be, oops, we pushed people too much. It can only be they hate us, which is not a great argument. So I think in large part the executive order is undoing Biden's earlier executive orders around establishing gender identity as the law of the land.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds right to me. It doesn't surprise me what you said about people on Blue Sky. I mean, what's your assessment in a more general sense of how Democrats are going to react to this? Because you get the sort of harder core people pontificating on Blue Sky. But do you think the Democratic Party is capable of adapting to this executive order in any way, manner, shape, or form that goes beyond 100% resistance? These people are apostles of hatred and division, or are they completely fucked, basically? I mean, Trump has basically said something that most people believe, and, the Democrats are just going to lie down on the railroad tracks.
I mean, to be outraged by this is to be outraged by the world is round, right? To be outraged by there are two sexes. I mean, I just sometimes want to say, how did you get here? How did we all get here? It's just about reproduction, and it doesn't determine what we like to wear, what we like to do, what toys we play with, who we're friends with, or whose toolbox is in the pantry. I actually just recalled thinking at some point that it was my stepfather's toolbox, and my mom said, how do you think, who was fixing everything before he got here? And we've had this toolbox your whole life. I mean, people don't seem to realize now that they can maintain the reality of their sex and look and behave any way they want. And
Yeah, it's just completely. I mean, I'm hardly the first one to say this. All the gender critical feminists are all over this, but it's pretty reactionary. It's sort of anti-feminist. I mean, it's like, you can't act as a woman in any way you want and still be a woman. I mean, it just doesn't make much sense, right? I mean, if you, in fact, you are adopting the characteristics of the other biological sex, you may, in fact, be that other biological sex is simply being a gender non-conforming, biological sex you are. So I've always found that quite extraordinary, just as you do. Do you think that there's going to be a ton of litigation here? The ACLU has probably already prepared 985 lawsuits about this. So do you have any sense of that litigation landscape and how successful this is likely to be? Or is it just, sort of trying to have the death by a thousand cuts of this particular executive order?
well, these are all good questions I think you would be really good at answering them, especially the first one about will Democrats come around, because I want to go back to that one for a second too.
Okay.
And we can both talk about it, because your book, Where Have All the Democrats Gone? Your chapter on the transgender issues was so good and so concise, and everyone should read it. If I hope that when I'm done with this book, everyone reads that too, because I'm going to go into a lot of detail about how this happened, and that's relevant to this discussion too, because a lot of it happened from a combination of very early lawsuits in the 90s. Mm-hmm. But I think it also happened because it turns out you can kneecap liberals, especially white women liberals, just by telling them they're bad people, and they'll do anything to try to dissuade you that they're not. But so will the Democrats learn from the last election? You predicted that this issue really made Democrats vulnerable. And then when we looked at the polling after, in fact, it did. And those ads, Kamala is for they, them, Trump is for you, were incredibly effective. And the people who didn't like them said they were anti-trans, but that's not how I perceived them. I perceived them as just like they, them is about elitism. They, them is about privileging identity over real meat and potatoes issues, the economy, housing, crappy public schools. So the gender issues are a stand-in for all of the elitism. Did they learn? It doesn't sound like it. Even Seth Moulton, who spoke out about women's sports, didn't vote for that, sex-based sports bill.
Only two Democrats, right? It was Vicente Gonzalez and I think some other Hispanic rep from South Texas. That was it.
Yeah. Even the people who had spoken out didn't, and it probably won't pass in the next round. And it's very bizarre what Biden did in terms of Title IX, right? Where he insisted that the protections include gender identity, but gender identity is often in direct conflict with sex. So I can't tell if they're learning, and I can't tell if they see that a lot of the lawsuits that occurred in the past 4 years, that they're going to likely win, right? That likely in the Scarametti case at the Supreme Court, which was about, is it sex discrimination if you give, say, puberty blockers for an actual physical condition, but not for, gender dysphoria or your own like private sense of self. Likely they're going to say, no, that's not sex discrimination. They already ruled that states are allowed to override Title IX, as I understand it. It doesn't look like the lawsuits are going the way the kind of trans activist lobby wants. But what I noticed is that when I looked back at the history of how gender identity became institutionalized in our schools, in medicine and psychology, in all kinds of policy, what I noticed was that often it was begun by lawsuits and then followed by lots of lawsuits. That the whole thing has actually been litigated even more than it's been emotionally felt. And I'm not sure how many people realize that all the liberals that have come to accept that a child could be born in the wrong body, a lot of it started from lawsuits and made its way into schools or policy.
Yeah, my understanding actually is that there's actually some pretty good evidence and documentation that among the activists who've been pushing this agenda, both here and in the UK, there's been some understanding of the idea that the way we can be the most effective is by lobbying institutional actors, by pushing litigation and legislation sort of below the radar, that it's not about persuading people this is the right approach. It's about using the levers of power that are potentially available to us using the money we have at our disposal and the activist muscle we have at our disposal. And the last thing you want to do is have a public debate about this. The last thing you want to do. So I think it's been wildly successful in some ways, but now obviously the pushback has begun and is gathering speed, and it wasn't going to last forever. I want to touch on here, speaking of, I guess the question you're asking, Lisa, is our liberals learning?
Yeah.
And I've got my doubts. I mean, I do think this is still a hill they're willing to die on, but I hope I'm wrong about that. But maybe, I'm not wrong, because let's think about something you recently experienced, which I found fascinating. You appeared in a panel to discuss Resolution 248 of the Community Education Council of District 2, the largest school district in Manhattan, to review the New York City Department of Education's 2019 gender guidelines. This is a resolution to have a review. Firestorm. The trans activists came out of the woodwork, and you participated in a panel that was organized by Maud Marin, who's one of the council members. It was you, the gay writer and activist Ben Apple, and the trans woman Corey Cohn. And it was a public meeting, parents could come and so on. And there's a really good recounting of it on Ben Apple's Substack. And also, I guess you put the YouTube up on your Substack so you can check it out. So review this fascinating little piece of microhistory for us. What was the resolution? Why the fuss? And what happened at this meeting with your panel? Because it seems pretty indicative of a lot of the madness around this issue.
Yeah, this is a crazy story that honestly I was hoping Pamela Paul would write about, but sadly, I don't know if you've heard, but she's been forced out at the New York Times, and she was the only opinion writer. Not
really?
only
they cashiered Pamela?
Yeah, they cashiered
Oh,
Pamela.
that sucks.
It sucks. And not only was she the only person willing to write about it, but many of us, I haven't published an op-ed with the Times since 2020, and I've sent a lot of them in. And in the past few months, I had been told, well, Pamela Paul already covered that, even if she hadn't. So they definitely they wanted to pigeonhole Pamela Paul as the lone kind of turfy person, not let any other voices in, and then say she'd already covered it. So this is a big loss, and I hope someone does cover it, because the only article about it in the New York Times is about our school board member Maud Marin, who's running for Manhattan DA. As a right-wing bigot activist. So last year, Maud Marin, as mentioned, passed Resolution 248. And it passed our local school board. This happens to be my kids' school board. Both my kids are in this district, going to school in this district. And it said, let's revisit the 2019 New York City DOE guidelines about gender, especially around sports, that say everything has to be divided by gender identity. And let's revisit them and allow female athletes, evolutionary biologists, doctors, scientists, etc., to participate and weigh in. So that was the resolution that sparked this debate, to say, let's talk about it and include a variety of stakeholders. The reaction to that was 8 or 9 months of intense activism, where at each school board meeting, all of these activists would show up, and they would be coordinated. They would tell each other to wear white and or a keffiyeh. And when anyone saying something they didn't like was set to speak, or they assumed they wouldn't like it, they should hum, dance, etc. So they had disrupted months and months and months of meetings. And in fact, I was deplatformed by my own school in the district. I was set to give a great talk on the history of childhood gender stereotypes, and I don't even talk about gender identity. But a parent had complained that a known transphobe, and again, as we said when we began, if you look me up, this is the first thing that comes up, right?
Right.
So known transphobe was going to be platformed, and we couldn't just have that one point of view. And I said, what other point of view about childhood gender stereotypes would you like? Would you like to include someone who says girls can only wear pink and boys must wear pants? Because if you want to put someone like that with me, that's fine. But that's not what I'm talking about. So I've been totally frozen out by the school and a lot of the parents at the school. And then Maud could not schedule me in the main meeting, the main council meeting, because again, for months, it's been nothing but humming, dancing, Macarena, keffiyeh protests. So there's a subcommittee on academic affairs that Maud chairs, Maud and another woman. So she scheduled the three of us to speak. And what's funny is when I've known Corey and Ben for years, and we collaborate a lot. Since then, we actually started a podcast of our own that we've been calling Informed Dissent. So we didn't even think about how it was our podcast was taking a field trip to speak at this meeting. This meeting was there were many fewer attendees, which was actually great, because who wants to be disrupted and prevented from speaking? They were forced to listen to us. But one reason it was poorly attended was that no one in the DOE or the local community education council, which is our school board, would send it out. My school wouldn't send it out. The PTA wouldn't send it out. No one would share information about this meeting. So we had fewer attendees, but the ones who came were very angry at us, and they did try to shut us down, and they did try the coordinated tactics of, when we spoke, everybody put your head down, etc. They were very hostile. But they ended up having to listen to us. And here we have a transsexual who realized in adulthood that he was actually a gay man and regrets the surgery. We have a gay man who was very gender nonconforming and bullied as a child. And then you have whatever I am, your kind of standard liberal feminist, hairy armpit, vaguely bisexual, and mother of a very masculine daughter who comes from a family with a lot of lesbians and married into a family with a lot of lesbians who include a lot of masculine women. And, what we were saying is not that different from what the executive order that Trump put out said. And I'm going to publish something about this tomorrow, but it's complicated, I think, for those of us who have been making these arguments for a long time. It's hard when those arguments come out of Donald Trump's mouth.
Right,
and
sure. Yeah.
I think it's scaring people, because they may disagree with the Democrats, but they don't want to disagree. They don't want to agree with Trump. So
Yeah. Like biological sex reality of biological sex is right coded. like a lot of things that are pretty sensible that are now right coded. And I think that's what keeps a lot of liberals down on the farm. We'll get more into what motivates our liberal friends, but I think that's one of them. It's like, if I say X, therefore I am on the right because this is right coded, even if I sort of believe it myself. So I think that helps keep them on the reservation, so to speak. Yeah, no, it's also profoundly weird that, sort of free speech, free exchange of ideas, the idea that we should listen to people from all different sort of ideological realms and try to sort out what is true and what is not. I mean, the idea that the left is now appears to be 100% against that because because reasons, because, platforming, because it would allow the fascists to take over, because words are violence, whatever. There's all kinds of, I think, pretty meretricious reasons for this. But nevertheless, it is very unfashionable in the left now to be for the free exchange of ideas, which I think is quite extraordinary. I want to talk yet about another experience of yours, Lisa, because you've had so many interesting experiences in this realm. You went to a forum for a Democratic candidate. I guess they're running for, they want to be the Democratic nominee for mayor of New York. And you wanted to chat with this gentleman, I think it was a gentleman, about some reasonable questions you have about the democratic orthodoxy on trans issues. So tell us what happened when you tried to do this, because I think in a way it's sort of amusing and sort of horrifying.
Yeah, I want to preface it by saying, I've lived in my Brooklyn neighborhood for
the People's Republic of Brooklyn, of course.
The People's Republic of Brooklyn for off and on for 32 years. When I moved to New York City, I moved in with my brother in the East Village, which was kind of disgusting then. We lived in a tenement. And he said, you should move out to this neighborhood in Brooklyn. It's going to kind of remind you of the college towns we grew up in, and it's super cheap. So I did because those were the days. If only I'd had the money for the real estate then. So, this neighborhood evolved around me, and it evolved, I wouldn't say ideologically so much. It was always liberal, but it became very wealthy. And I think there's a particular defensiveness around wealthy liberals. So the people I am interacting with on a daily basis, and I mean in real life, because the people I interact with around this issue are incredibly diverse in lots of ways, not racially, but politically, ideologically, lots of gay people, lots of transsexuals, sometimes super right-wing people. I'm interacting with more different kinds of people than I ever have. But in my neighborhood, it's all New York Times and PR. And therefore they have a tiny slice of this story, because those outlets are unable to report the full complexity, because as you so eloquently explained, liberals are now the ones against viewpoint diversity. So I'm still trying to figure out how to operate in the place I live. And my husband is still, he's much more comfortable with all these people than I am now because I'm a heretic. But I have to live here. And I was happy to be invited to this fundraiser for Brad Lander, who is our city comptroller and used to be the council member from my neighborhood. And pleased that these liberal women in my neighborhood, one of whom actually her sister is a moderate Democrat. I'm not going to say who it is, but that's a rare bird right now, a moderate Democrat. So
I hear that.
I was happy to go, but I want to preface it by saying by the time I got there, I was exhausted. And ironically, I had been in D.C. I got a press pass to the Scrimeti hearing at the Supreme Court, which was fascinating. And after the Supreme Court hearing, I left, and there were two rallies out front. One, ACLU, trans is beautiful. And the other, on the right side of the Supreme Court, was like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Matt Walsh, plus Jamie Reed, who was a lesbian whistleblower from a gender clinic who was married to a trans man, and Roy Epen, who's Canadian and conservative, but he's a gay endocrinologist, and Ben Appel, who you mentioned, who's a gay writer, what probably was a liberal and is politically homeless now. So the rally on the right were all different kinds of people in support of these bans on youth gender medicine. And after that rally, I went over to a right-wing think tank, and inside this right-wing think tank were all those people, and these people like me, like frizzy hair feminist types, and bunch of gays and lesbians, detransitioners. There was a young detransitioned woman with a hat that said, a red hat that said, "Make gay bars gay again."
I like that one.
And it was amazing to me, the diversity of people in this notorious right-wing think tank, which I will name in the book. Whatever you're thinking, that's what it is. So I went in there, and I walked around talking to people from the family council and talking to Republicans and saying, listen, we all know about the history of youth gender medicine. And we know that when the Dutch started doing these experiments on kids in the 90s, that almost every one of the kids was same-sex attracted. And we know that this medicine is rooted in a lack of acceptance for gender nonconforming children who grow up to be gay. Even though they're the nice, open-minded Dutch, ultimately the medicine started so that these wildly gender nonconforming young children could pass as the opposite sex by never going through their endogenous or natal puberty, right? So I was going around saying, we all know most of the young kids with these quote unquote gender identities of the opposite sex will grow up to be gay if not socially transitioned and just left alone. And would you consider admitting that publicly? Okay, I'd been going around to Democrats for years saying, can you just accept that there are lesbians, gays, liberals, feminists, and even transsexuals who object to this series of ideas and have concerns about the medicine? And I got nowhere. And I spent years trying to get these articles in liberal media. I mean, it was so crazy making. And then I just realized, at first I was bummed about Trump winning because he is chaos and dangerous. But then I decided to take advantage of it as best I could. And I decided to go lobby Republicans. Could they publicly side with us? Could they not just use us to advance their agenda? And what I got, now this is the morning before I came back to Brooklyn and went to this fundraiser. What I got generally was, that's interesting. I'm not sure, but I'm willing to listen to you. Here's my card. Make an appointment. Let's talk. Okay, that
those
is
racist bigots. They're just trying to fool you. Right. So yeah, so pretty, friendly, open reception. And I gather this contrasted a bit with Brad Landerland as you experienced it.
That was intense. Now, I'll admit I came out swinging. I walked right in and I walked right up to him. And I knew almost everybody at this gathering. Uh-huh. And I was friends with the people who were talking to him. But I walked right up. I interrupted them. Again, I am not a demure, submissive female. I wasn't raised like that. I didn't end up like that. So I walked right up to him. I said, I came here specifically to talk to you about gender issues. And I think our side is wrong. and I'd like to explain my viewpoint and see if you're open to talking about it more. This is my ante, right? Like I'm seeing Willie let me in the game.
Yeah.
But the answer was no, and it got worse and worse and more hostile. And somehow it ended up to talking about Maud Marin, the woman who passed Resolution 248 and invited us to speak, etc. And he said, Maud is only doing that to wage political warfare. She doesn't care about that issue at all. And I disagree completely, not just about Maud, but about most of the people involved in this, including the people on the right. I think they very much care, for a variety of reasons. And it's not just rooted in their narrow idea of normal. I think they see people getting hurt. They've listened to detransitioners. And while, yes, the right wants converts and the left wants to dismiss all heretics, so they treat us differently, I still think that there are a lot of overlapping values. Now, and the overlapping values on the left are, we all care about kids, but we have a very different idea of what's the best way to express that. So Lander was incredibly hostile to me. I was no picnic myself, I'll admit it. And at one point, when we were talking about the sports issue, and I said, what is so terrible about asking female athletes their opinion? And he grabbed the host's daughter, teenage daughter, and said, come over here. Do you care if there are trans girls in your sports? And I got right in front of her and I said, don't do that. That is incredibly unkind and unprofessional. And that's not the issue we're talking about. We're not talking about put one woman on the spot, because part of the reason this has happened is that we made it taboo to speak the truth. We stigmatized the truth about sex, and we stigmatized any kind of viewpoint diversity. So we can't make policy if we can't actually listen to multiple stakeholders because they don't feel safe speaking up. And putting a teenage girl on the spot to be responsible for speaking up for all female athletes. I don't even know if this girl plays sports. It was just horrendous.
Yeah, bogus, man.
It was bad news. And so no, that Democrat didn't learn. Will the other ones?
Yeah, we'll see. Now, didn't Lander at one point say, I thought this was, I think I'm remembering this right, said, I may not be the candidate for you, right? I mean, I think this is rather extraordinary because I think it just does show the extent to which this is a hill so many Democrats are willing to die on. I literally don't want your vote unless you're sort of totally down with the program on this particular issue. I think that's amazing. And also, I think completely counterproductive, though it may help Brad Lander, I guess, win the nomination. I don't know. It's friggin' New York City, man. And the primary electorate is different than the overall electorate. But still, I just think it's indicative of the sort of cavalier attitude toward the median voter that I think a lot of Democrats have on this issue, because they think, I mean, I can't in all good conscience ask for the voice of bigots and transphobes. Yeah, well, I got news for you, pal. That's 3/4 of the American population, according to a lot of recent polls. If you're looking at views in some of these trans issues, like biological boys and girls sports, if you're looking about puberty blockers and hormones for people under 18, this isn't even close. This is like a 70-30 issue. So I think that's pretty amazing. So I want to get to another one of your recent, not an adventure, but a post. You said Democrats really are for they, them, who's for us. Liberals must stop trying to be seen as good people and start trying to do the right thing. I think this is part of your theory of how liberals are kept down on the farm on a lot of this stuff. And you called it liberalitis. So explain what you mean by that, and sort of the role you think it may be playing in sort of the stasis on this issue.
I came to see liberal support of gender identity ideology as being almost entirely about virtue signaling. And I began to think a lot about the concept of virtue signaling and what is it, It's raising your hand and saying, "No, really, I'm good. Really, I'm on the right side of history."
Right, right.
And I was raised as an atheist. I was raised to be suspicious of religion, but I was very jealous of it. Very much wanted to be a Christian. I would get, I mean, technically we're Jewish, but I didn't have much to do with it because my parents were so anti-religion. And and part of it, I think, was that I thought that people were having donuts at church, and I had a very health food childhood, so I thought I could go to
those donuts. Who could
I
blame you?
wanted. I thought I learned the word refreshments by 5 years old, and was disappointed when my mom did let me go to church, and disappointed to find out that I did not get any refreshments. But I think without religion, without God on your side, without a clear set of morals that you can follow to kind of get to the door of heaven, liberals are vulnerable. We're susceptible. We don't have a strong sense of self, I think. And we were told that this was the kind and compassionate thing to follow this series of steps, whether that be affirm a gender identity, respect the pronouns of a person whose sex is quite plain to us, even if it interrupts what we know to be the truth. And I think every time you do that, every time you see a male in front of you and have to call that person a she, or, every time the New York Times reports about a crime, a rapist, a serial killer, and they call that person she when it's so clear that the person is male, every time you do that, you're further kind of pledging into this religion and pledging into this. I mean, I can only assume this is what it's like in a cult, where you're constantly asked to deny what you know to be true, and it makes you more and more pliable. I think that's what happened with liberals, and I think with the combination of COVID and social media and George Floyd, and I just think a lot of us felt very complicit in America's sins. We have real sins, obviously. We have the Native American genocide, we have slavery, we have what we did to women for so long, and we have structural racism. Some of it still exists. We maybe don't have redlining, but we have the fallout, or we had crack cocaine versus powder cocaine laws. There are real ways that we've institutionalized unfairness based on different groups that people belong to. But this series of beliefs and the rituals attached to it, they don't undo that.
No.
All they do is keep us from speaking up. And I actually think that it starts with white fragility. I think if you talk to
Robin DiAngelo's in the house.
I do. I mean, I think for me that was an important moment because I was part of my kids' elementary school. We started a diversity committee, and I joined it because I wanted people to understand that this little girl who looked so much like a boy, that didn't need anything special. We didn't really ask for anything special other than just kind of get over it, And I just want to say, I'm going off on a tangent, which I tend to do, but the fascinating thing about having a child like that in like 2013, 2014, was that the school said, look, we can say something. We can spend 5 minutes in the kindergarten class saying, hey, some girls are like that. Some boys are girlish, the end. But ultimately, you got to equip your child with what to say, because your child is the one navigating the world. And it was brilliant, because the kindergarten teacher said, We have sometimes girls like to wear sweatpants and they like short hair and they play with lots of boys, and sometimes girls like dresses and pink. And then the
Hmm.
rest of it was just saying to my kid, oh, when you're in the bathroom and they tell you you're in the wrong bathroom, you just say, oh, no, I'm a girl. It's fine. Don't engage, don't explain.
Right.
If only all these kids were getting this advice. It's amazing how quickly that went by the wayside, and that the woman who gave us that advice just a few years later ended up having, a trans kid who she medically transitioned and probably would never give that advice to anyone again.
Yeah, the rapidity of this change is pretty remarkable. And I think I agree it has a lot to do with liberalitis, that the tendency to put a high value on virtue signaling, not want to be categorized negatively by your peers. Um, but this is kind of a tricky question. How much of it is people, as they say these things, actually believe what they're saying, have talked themselves into it in a sense? Or how much of it is outright preference falsification? In other words, sort of
Mm.
inside you don't believe X, but you're going to say X anyway because
Mm.
you'll be sanctioned if you don't, or you want to get along. Where do you draw? I mean, how much? I mean, I realize it's a tricky question. How much of it is actual beliefs, and how much of it is preference falsification? It's hard to draw the line on these things. One may bleed into the other, and then you also have the role of people who literally are believers, right? The activists in the institutions, in the HR departments, the academics, the activists who are in these nonprofit organizations, the advocacy groups. I mean, some significant percentage of those people really 100% believe what they're saying. And they're, in a sense, the enforcers and the spreaders of the faith. So I don't know where I'm going with this, but I'm just curious what your take is on sort of the different flavors of people who are part of this movement or whatever you want to call it.
It's a really good question. What I'm thinking is most people were like me, are like I was.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't even think to question it. It's just the next thing that came down the pike, so of course you believe it. But when you talk about the most recent polls, the New York Times poll, which, by the way, didn't report on anything about gender in the poll, but it did show that 70% of people tend to be against what would now be under the umbrella of trans rights because they didn't know what it involved before.
Right,
They
right.
didn't know it meant, oh, boys can identify as girls and play in women's sports. Oh, we didn't know that the medicine could be harmful. We didn't know there were detransitioners. We didn't know that the medicine was designed to essentially make gay kids conform, and that the bulk of people getting this medicine are nothing like the people that it was tested on in the 90s, So I think people know enough now to form an opinion. I think before it was just, well, of course. Well, of course I support
Yeah,
trans rights.
I'm for rights. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm for rights. This is, Biden said in 2012, this is the next great civil rights movement. It
Yes.
just
Mm-hmm.
seemed, it was just the new gay, and it seemed exactly the same. So I think the reason there's so much censorship is that those who are the true believers, or whether or not they believe it, who want these rights, who want the right to declare their own sex, their movement depends on keeping people misinformed.
Yeah, I mean, it's a rights issue. There's a lot of wires hanging from the ceiling on this one. I mean, and arguably, it's just basically a category error. It's not really a rights issue in the classic civil rights anti-discrimination sense. It's policy issues having to do with medical care for kids. It's sort of ideological issues about how do you look at the question of biological sex, uh, so on and so forth. I mean, what do you think about, why should biological boys be able to play in girl sports? Is that a right? Or is that like kind of a policy question that is bound up with gender ideology and gender identity? So the whole thing gets very confused very fast. There's one reason why I suspect why people don't want this delved into too much, which leads to another question I have, which is my sense is that in certain quarters, even in some quarters of the trans rights, quote unquote, movement, there's a sense, hey, maybe we went too far. We need to moderate things a little bit, not scare the shit out of people all the time. But here's my question. If you shear off all the things from the trans rights movement that are not really about rights, that are about so-called gender affirming care, that are about pronouns, that are about girls and boys and girls sports, sort of preferred pronouns are mandatory, whatever. What's left, right? Because anti-discrimination is already the law of the land, right? From Bostock. I mean, you're not allowed to discriminate against transgender identifying people in housing, employment, access to whatever. I mean, it's just like with gay people. They can get married, they can do all this other stuff. So what is left of the trans agenda once you shear off all that other stuff? I mean, I'm actually, I don't see it.
I mean, Bostock is important because, in theory, a man should not be fired for wearing a dress. Though in that particular case, the person who was fired, I think, worked at a funeral home, and I suppose it might be unsettling for some people when they go to grieve and there's someone who makes them uncomfortable. But so what? I mean, part of the difficulty here is that we actually it is hard for us to accommodate males in dresses and makeup, hair bands aside, from metal bands from the 80s and whatnot. Like, we're not comfortable with that. Okay. And that's a big issue. What are we going to do? Because a lot of men seem to want to either wear women's clothes, or some of them want to change their bodies to emulate female genitalia or to grow breasts with hormones. And they're not women, they're a variation of men. They're not going to go anywhere. So we do have to figure out, how to organize our society. The fundamental question, the trans rights question, is about, do we organize our society based on sex in places where we're segregating people, or do we do it based on your personal, deeply felt gender identity that no one else can see and which may change? And again, all these policies happen without actually asking anyone, or without most people understanding what they were assenting to. But no, you should not be kicked out of you should not be evicted, because you identify as something or wear something. You should be allowed to be employed. That ruling is important. Mm-hmm. I think the movement, and even the gay rights movement, where it went too far, I mean, where it goes too far is probably back to the cake. We need to reconsider the cake. I can't remember the name of the case where, the baker in Colorado who didn't want to put the cake topper, make a gay wedding cake, or put the two, same-sex couple on top of the wedding cake. And I think conservatives were sold the bridge, which was, we're not going to impose on you. We just want the same rights as you. So right. Let us get married. Part of it. Yeah. Let us get married too. Let's not even if civil unions could afford us all the same rights, let's, elevate us to the same kind of cultural, societal status and legal status, and then we'll all peacefully coexist. But pretty soon after that, it was, no, you got to bake us a cake. You actually have to endorse this thing that you don't agree with. And I don't think that's particularly in keeping with what I would like to think is, the American attitude. I, as an atheist, despite trying very hard to believe, I've grown up surrounded by people who have these beliefs that I don't share. Mm-hmm. And I'm fine with it. And I always say, especially now that I know a lot more conservative Christians, but I used to know liberal Christians, and I would say, if you want to pray for me, I'm into it. It's possible, technically I'm agnostic. Right. Because how can I actually know? And right, yeah. And I love it when people pray for me, but don't make me pray. So I think this movement went horribly wrong pretty early on by saying you have to participate in my lifestyle and belief system, and that only got worse.
Right. Well, the trans rights, quote unquote, movement basically takes that and dials it up to not just 11, but maybe 110. Right.
Yeah.
I mean, you've really got to buy into a lot of stuff. You really have to participate in this entirely new belief system about the nature of sex and gender and how people are treated and viewed. And, everything has to be reordered on that basis. I mean, that's a big ask. And I think we're now finding people are less interested in it than they had supposed. But here's another issue that sort of lies underneath a lot of this transformation we've seen taking place, which now may be moving back in the other direction. But what about the medical sort of endorsement of this change? I mean, it is absolutely gobsmacking how uniform the support for so-called gender-affirming care and that whole ideology has been in the medical profession, all the trade associations. How does this happen? I think people who hear that the AMA or the Pediatrics Association or endocrinology, whatever, they think, that must be the science. They've looked at the science and they've come to an objective conclusion. So I know you've written about this, Leo Sapir has written about it. So what's that really about? How did we get to a situation where there's this incredibly uniform level of support throughout the medical profession, or at least their associations? I think you may I'll make this point for you. They're really trade associations. They aren't scientific bodies, but
that's the first part.
How did this happen? And is it just follow the money, or is it sort of some ideological capture, or what's going on here?
I think this is related to your other question about how many people are actual believers. Mm-hmm. And I think that this issue, especially of a cohort that the Dutch called juvenile transsexuals, and if we still use that term, none of this would be happening. But I think part of what happened was, an awareness of this cohort arose out of what was happening with the Dutch. And then when Jazz Jennings made the debut in 2007 on Barbara Walters, and then Nicole Maines, who was a similarly transitioned before puberty male and passed as female and became a TV star, right? And we had this huge emergence, not just of trans adults, but of trans kids. And again, the idea of born in the wrong body taking hold. And my opinion is that most people didn't want to touch this. There's a kind of ick factor to it, and it's very strange and confusing. And so I think it's less than that there's consensus or most people believe it. I think it's that they left it to the true believers. So, there's a 2018 policy statement from the American Academy of Pediatrics that's written by one guy, kind of effeminate gay guy. And there are a lot of effeminate gay men involved in pediatric gender medicine, which is something that's, again, also hard to talk about. Why is that? But we don't know for sure. I think they may want to save kids from the pain that they felt, or they might want the kids to be able to live out the fantasies that they had. But a lot of these policies were written by one or two true believers who were not really the mainstream, and without thinking necessarily that it would have huge impact, because in the beginning it was very few kids like this were rare.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And I do think, yes, we don't have, in the European countries where they've attempted to pull back on this, the government's paying for it. And they have a fiduciary duty to the citizens to not be paying for things that hurt people or that have low quality, low certainty evidence. So it's easier to pull it back, but we don't have that here. We have a very bizarre healthcare, quote unquote, system, a lot of it for profit, almost all of it. And you can find, I'm forgetting the year, it's maybe 2016, Medicare and Medicaid did an evidence review and said there's no evidence to cover this. But then they ended up having to anyway. So in our one little bit of not-for-profit healthcare, they were quite aware that there's no evidence. So I think what happened was this protocol that's designed for a scant number of people, and which was promoted by a few kind of true believing ideologues that everyone thought would be off to the side, got mainstreamed.
Yeah.
And also shoved down everybody's throats.
Jack Turban, we're looking at you.
by way of, and was institutionalized in schools, in medicine, in the law. And if you look at, in 2015, there's a guide that gets released called Schools in Transition, and it's about how to socially transition children at school.
Yeah.
And early on, there's all of these organizations working together, GLSEN and GLAAD and medical associations. So these advocacy groups, they all work together in concert to push this. But I don't even know if they knew that it would catch on like this.
Yeah. They succeeded beyond their wildest expectations. So, yeah, you mentioned the European countries that were walking a lot of this stuff back and actually have done evidence-based reviews. And in particular, the one, I really don't know how many people have heard of this, the Cass report. I mean, obviously, you know about it. I know about it, people who follow this. But my sense is that most even halfway informed people still don't know about it. And I think a lot of docs have never looked at it. I mean, do you think that's fair?
I think that's fair to say. So the Cass review is I believe it's 388-page report headed by a British pediatrician named Hilary Cass, very well respected. And the NHS asked her to do this review after lots of whistleblowing complaints from their gender clinic, and after other government agencies found that the youth gender clinic was not fit for purpose. I can't remember the exact wording, but they were not doing a good job, and kids were getting hurt. And they had actually tried to replicate the Dutch research on which all of this medicine is based, and were unable to replicate it. The kids actually did not get better with blockers and hormones and surgeries, and that had been suppressed. So she did this report, and she did what I have tried to do, that it's a lot harder for me now, which is talk to people from all over the spectrum. I've interviewed Chase Strangio, and I've interviewed people at the Heritage Foundation, and I've interviewed middle of the road people, and I have just tried to incorporate all these different perspectives. But like Hilary Cass did after talking to everyone, I came to the same conclusion, right? I mean, most people who let in a variety of perspectives come to the same conclusion, and that's partly because anytime there has been a systematic review of the evidence, which is you take anything that's relevant, you take it in, you parse it, you look at the quality of evidence, every one of them has come out in the exact same way, which is the quality of evidence is too low. There's no certainty that this will help. It could hurt. There's no way to know. And if every kid was told, and every parent at every gender clinic or Planned Parenthood, every health class was told, this could make your life better or it could ruin your life, and there's no research to tell, I just think people would be making very different decisions if that was the language being used. But here, the Cass review was covered a little bit in the New York Times, which was good. And then there was one in-depth interview with Hilary Cass on some NPR show out of WBUR in Boston. And that's pretty much it. And when I was speaking at an event recently that had, and I told them, liberals don't believe you that you care. They really think you just want to make your, Christian world, and you have no concern for kids. And they said, how could that be? How could liberals feel that way after, for instance, the Cass review? And I said, they've never heard of it. They don't know what's happening. They were told that first they were told there's nothing happening in these other countries. Then they were told, oh yeah, England, Sweden, Finland. I think something even happened in Germany. They're told that any European country that's shifting in their approach or attitudes, they've been taken over by right-wing activists just like here. That is not what's happening. What's happening is they're listening to all the voices and they're looking at the evidence. And anytime you do that, you realize this is very bad. This is not okay. And we have to be able to name that and discuss it without being dismissed as bigots.
Yeah, the Finnish doc who actually started pediatric gender clinics in Finland, I believe this is correct. She was the one who led the final evidence-based review of it in Finland that actually led them to pull back, very substantially on what they've been doing because, hey, evidence is that we can't really say it works and it might hurt, so let's not do it. Anyway, but again, I think you're right that most people in America don't know about this. And even in the highest profile thing of the Cast Review, they don't know about it. And that's a shame, and they should. So before we leave this freighted topic, I just wanted you to give us a teaser about the book you're working on, when we can hope to see it, and just what's going on with that.
Great question. I
Or do you hate being asked about what you're going
No,
to
no. I'm dying to finish it. It has taken me a really long time, and part of it is that I over-reported because the stories of how it happened, how did we get to the point where saying that biological sex is real and boys shouldn't play on a girls' sports team is considered hate speech, right? Like that's how did we get to a point where everyone in my zip code thinks that a child will kill him or her or their self if everyone in the entire world doesn't go along with their self-conception, especially Gen X boomers older, because there were no such kids and there was no such medication and there are no bodies. There are no piles of bodies from before 1998 when, this first started across the world. So I'm answering those questions, and the stories are fascinating to me because I want to tell you this guy transitioned in Seattle, and then he started this conference, and then this lesbian showed up and they met on the escalator, and guess what? All these years later, there's a $10 million NIH grant that where they suppressed the suicides of 2 out of 315 participants. But in order to do that, I would have to be writing a 1,200-page book. So what I have realized is that in this era of identity-based publishing, in which people are, objectivity used to be the kind of prized ingredient in journalism, and then we got to the point where we had own voices in literature, and then it leaked into journalism, and then it was one voice. So you cannot speak about this issue if you are not part of the group being talked about.
Yeah,
and I suppose on some level, it has taken me a long time to invest myself with the authority of, look, I've been down in this rabbit hole for 8 years. I felt complicit because I didn't think I was reporting honestly. I learned some things that motivated me to tell the truth. I tried for 4 years straight to tell the truth in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Time Magazine. The list goes on. Nobody would let me. And I didn't want to do it in right-wing media. So it took years, and finally I just said to my agent, I can't take it anymore. I'm I'm just going to die if I don't get to tell the truth. And we ended up finding a great publisher. But I think it's taken me a year and a half of writing it to realize that I have the authority to get out in front of the story and tell you what happened, and I don't have to report 1,200 words to do it. And that's why it's taken so long. But I want to explain to you ultimately how liberal America came to support this, and the mechanisms by which it got institutionalized and became difficult to dissent about. And that's what I'm doing, and I'm excited about it, but I cannot wait for it to be over.
Yeah, like, speaking as someone who's written books, I could relate to that. So this it really sounds great. I'm really looking forward to this book. I think everybody should keep their eye out for it. And in the meantime, you can read her other books, and you can certainly, on a regular basis, read Broadview, her excellent Substack. And I guess you also have now this podcast, Informed Dissent, with some of your colleagues. So that's probably worth checking out. But Lisa, I want to thank you for being on The Liberal Patriot. This is a great conversation. We could have gone on and on and on, but we won't. Hopefully we've given people something to think about. And Lisa, if you're ever in Washington, you must come by AEI and I'll buy you lunch. It'll be fun.
I would love that. And I'm such a fan, and I really appreciate your support of people like me talking about this, and how hard you work to understand it. It means a lot to me, so thank you.
Well, thank you. Yeah, the truth will out.